Today we're talking about Now and Then, the Beatles single, which just came out. There's a whole story behind it. And I'm going to be showing you my vinyl copy, which is just a single. And I'll probably do that first in the video, and then afterwards I'm going to tell the whole story. This is going to be a longer video than I usually do on this particular channel. So let's just jump right into it. I'll go first into showing the vinyl. And then I'm going to start into the story, which is going to be divided into chapters and all that. I did it differently. It's pretty cool. Stick around for it. So let's continue. Let's take a look at the single. So let me take a look. The Beatles, Now and Then, the new vinyl single. There's a little sticker there. Here's the price tag. It's in Mexican pesos, which comes out to maybe about 12 to 15 US dollars. And here's the single, and you can see where it was bought, which is a store in Mexico City which sells records and music and stuff like that. Let me flip it over. Here's the back cover where you can see it says the Beatles here. There's the Now and Then, and here is just a sticker, the import sticker, and then here's some more. There's more info, and it has the B-side of Love Me Do, and then there's some more. It says Made in Germany, and there's some just stuff that's kind of hard to read for me. So let's take a look inside. This also came with an insert, which is pretty good. So here, I guess this is a reproduction of what John originally wrote. And here are the official lyrics. Actually, they're not the lyrics, they're the credits. And here's Love Me Do, where again it has the credits. Let's look on the other side. And this is basically tells the whole story of everything behind this, which is what I'm going to be telling in the video anyway. So if you want to stick around for that. But let's continue. Okay, as you can see, it's a 7-inch. So let me zoom in a little closer. It has the green Apple logo where it says Now and Then. This one, it says manufactured in the United States. And there's just the code there. And let me flip it over because it actually looks pretty different. And here, it has the Parlophone sticker with the Love Me Do. I assume this is what it was supposed to look like when it first came out, because Love Me Do was their first single. And there's some more little info there and like stickers and such. So looks pretty cool. So let me continue with the video. Let's go back to 1979. John Lennon was living in New York City in his famous apartment building called the Dakota. This was during what people called his house husband years. He was staying home, taking care of his son Sean, and just writing music for fun. One day, John sat down at his piano at home and recorded a song called Now and Then. He didn't go to a fancy studio or anything. He just put on a simple cassette recorder on top of his piano and started playing and singing. Here's the thing. This home recording had a lot of problems. You can hear the TV playing in the background. There was this annoying electrical buzzing around him the whole time. The recording was scratchy and not very clear at all. The song itself wasn't even finished. John mostly just sang the chorus over and over. He didn't really write full verses for it. It was like he had this beautiful melody and some words, but it was just a rough idea. Even though the recording was messy, you can tell it was a really sweet love song. John probably wrote it for his wife Yoko. It had that gentle, romantic feeling that his later songs often had. Now normally, if a recording has TV noise and electrical buzzing, you'd probably throw it away. But this recording was special because it gave us a peek into John's private life. It was like being in his living room while he was just playing around with music. All those background sounds and problems actually made the recording feel more real and personal. It wasn't polished or perfect. It was just John being John at home. But there's a problem. Because the recording was so messy, it would be almost impossible to turn into a real song that people could enjoy listening to. The technology back in 1979 just wasn't good enough to clean it up. So this little cassette tape sat around for years and years, waiting for someone to figure out how to make it sound better. Little did John know that this messy little recording would become one of the most important pieces of music history. This cassette tape would wait over 40 years before technology caught up and could finally make John's song sound the way it deserved to sound. Fast forward to 1994. John had been gone for 14 years, but something exciting was happening. Yoko Ono, John's wife, gave the remaining Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo, some of John's old home recordings that no one had ever heard before. The Beatles were working on something called the Beatles Anthology, basically a huge collection of their music and history. They'd already taken two of John's old demos and turned them into real songs, which were Free as a Bird and Real Love. Both songs were huge hits, so naturally they wanted to try Now and Then next. People started calling Paul, George, and Ringo the Threetles, since there were only three of them left. In February 1995, they went to the studio with a producer named Jeff Lynne to work on Now and Then. They spent about one afternoon trying to make it work. Paul played acoustic guitar and bass, George played acoustic and electric guitar, and Ringo played the drums. They were basically trying to build a whole song around John's voice from that old cassette tape. But remember all those problems with John's original recording, the TV in the background, the electrical buzzing, the scratchy sound. Well, in 1995, they still couldn't fix those problems. The technology back then could only do basic things like turning down certain sounds, but it couldn't separate John's voice from all the noise. Every time they tried to make John's voice clearer, it would make the whole song sound weird or bad. Here's where the story gets interesting and a bit confusing. For years, people said that George Harrison hated Now and Then and called John's demo rubbish. Paul McCartney said this is what happened, and since the Beatles always made decisions together, they stopped working on it. But wait, years later, a movie director named Peter Jackson found 14 hours of video footage from those 1995 recording sessions. When he watched it, he saw something different. George wasn't complaining about the song at all. He was actually working really hard, and he seemed to like it. So what was really going on? It seems like George's problem wasn't the song itself. It was like the terrible quality of the recording, I guess. He didn't want to make a new Beatles song that sounded bad just to match John's scratchy demo. George wanted it to sound perfect, or not at all. But there was something else going on too, something much deeper. Working with John's voice was really hard emotionally for Paul, George, and Ringo. Ringo said that hearing John's voice again really brought to the fore that John's gone. Can you imagine how that must have felt? They were all trying to make music with their friend who had died 15 years earlier. It was like he was there in the room with them, but also not there at all. So Now and Then got shelved again, but this time for multiple reasons. The technology still wasn't good enough to clean up John's recording. They didn't want to make a song that sounded bad. It was too emotionally difficult to work with John's voice. Maybe they felt like two new Beatles songs was enough. The Beatles had always been a democracy. Everyone had to agree. And in 1995, they just couldn't make it work. Song went back into storage, waiting for a better day. Now we get to the part of the story that shows us that making music isn't just about technical stuff. It's about feelings too. The Beatles weren't just trying to solve a problem. They were dealing with missing their friend and wanting to honor his memory in the right way. Sometimes the most important part of creating art is knowing when to stop and wait for the right moment. And for Now and Then, that moment was still almost 30 years away. For almost 30 years after 1995, Now and Then became like a musical legend. Beatles fans knew about this mysterious third song that the Beatles had tried to make but couldn't finish. People would talk about it online and wonder if it would ever see the light of day. But Paul McCartney never gave up. Even after all those years, even after George Harrison died in 2001, Paul kept saying he wanted to finish the song. He even thought about writing new verses himself and using some of George's old guitar recordings to complete it. Paul felt like he had unfinished business. This wasn't just any song, it was John's song, and Paul felt he owed it to his old friend to make it happen somehow. The longer the song stayed unfinished, the more special it became to fans and to Paul himself. Then something amazing happened in 2021. A director named Peter Jackson was making a documentary about the Beatles called Get Back. He had these old recordings of the band. They were really hard to hear. There was multiple people talking and playing instruments at the same time. So Peter Jackson's team created something incredible. They created this super smart computer program that could listen to old recordings and separate different sounds. They called it MAL or MAL, which was kind of a funny name after the Beatles' old friend Mal Evans. And it was also a take on the computer HAL from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Here's the cool part. Mal could take that messy recording of John singing Now and Then and do something that seemed impossible. It could separate John's voice from the piano, remove the TV noise in the background, and get rid of that annoying electrical buzzing, all while keeping John's voice sounding perfect. It was like having a superpowered audio detective that could pick apart every single sound and put them in separate boxes. The technology that couldn't work in 1995 finally existed in 2021. There was another important thing too. Sean Lennon gave them a much better copy of his dad's original recording. The Beatles had been working with a copy of a copy back in 1995, but now they had something much clearer to work with. Now people are worried that computers were creating a fake John Lennon voice, but that's not what happened at all. The computer didn't make up John's voice or change what he's saying. It just cleaned up the recording so we could finally hear what John had actually recorded back in 1979. Think of it like cleaning a dirty window. You're not changing what's behind the glass. You're just making it possible to see clearly for the first time. In 2022, with this amazing new technology, Paul and Ringo decided to try again. They were both in their 80s now, but they were determined to finish what they'd started almost 30 years later. Paul did a lot of the work. He played bass guitar, electric harpsichord, and sang backing vocals. He even played a slide guitar solo in the style of George Harrison as a way to honor his old friend. Paul also added some piano parts that sounded like John's style and helped write some new words for the song. Ringo recorded new drums and backing vocals from his home studio in Los Angeles. Even though he was far away, technology made it possible for him to be part of the song. Here is the most amazing part. If you remember those old guitar parts that George had recording way back in 1995 during those failed sessions, well, they kept those recordings all those years and now they could finally use them. So George Harrison, who had died in 2001, was still able to be part of the song. The producers also added a beautiful string section and even mixed in tiny bits of vocals from classic Beatles songs like Here, There and Everywhere and Eleanor Rigby. It was like they were weaving together this whole history of the Beatles into one song. When they finally finished Now and Then, the feelings were overwhelming. Paul said it felt like a genuine Beatles recording because all four of them played on it. Ringo got really emotional and said it was the closest we'll ever come to having them back in the room. It was like John was there. You know, it's far out. Even Sean Lennon, John's son, was moved by it. He said it was the last song my dad, Paul, George, and Ringo got to make together. It's like a time capsule and all feels very meant to be. After 44 years, John Lennon's little home recording had finally become a real Beatles song with all four members contributing their parts across different decades. It was like time travel through music. On October 26, 2023, the Beatles made an announcement that shocked the world. Now and Then was finally going to be released. You can imagine how excited fans were after waiting so many years. The song came out on November 2nd, 2023. All the streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music had it. Then the next day you can buy the physical copies, which is this right here, which was either the CDs or vinyl records, and there were different colors. So it was like Christmas for the Beatles fans. And what was really cool, they released Now and Then as a double single, paired with Love Me Do, as I was showing you before on this record here, which was the Beatles' first hit song from 1962. So we have their first song from the last song together on the same record. It was like completing a perfect circle after more than 60 years. And they made a 12-minute documentary called Now and Then, the last Beatles song that told the whole story that we've been talking about. Plus, Peter Jackson made a music video using old footage of the Beatles that people had never seen before. When Now and Then came out, it went straight to #1 in the UK, Germany, and Austria. It made top 10 in tons of other countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia. But here's the amazing part. This was the Beatles' first #1 hit since 1969, which is a 54-year gap between chart toppers. No band in history had ever done that before. They even beat Kate Bush's record for the longest time between #1 songs. And get this, Now and Then became the first song that used AI technology to get nominated for a Grammy Award. It made history in so many ways. When Now and Then came out, people had a lot of different opinions. Many fans and critics loved it. They called it the perfect ending to the Beatles story. They said it was a beautiful way to say goodbye. But not everyone felt the same way. Some people thought the song was too polished, didn't sound natural. Others worried that they were just using AI to make it sound less authentic, and it wasn't really the Beatles anymore. There were other fans who were disappointed that George Harrison's parts were pretty small, since they came from these old 1995 recordings, and they wanted to hear more of him on what was supposed to be the final Beatles song. But for most people, none of that technical stuff mattered. What mattered was how the song made them feel. Fans said they got chills hearing John's voice again. Many people cried listening to it because it reminded them of someone they lost, or it felt like saying goodbye to their childhood. People called it an elegy, which is like a sad, beautiful poem about someone who's died. For many fans, it wasn't just about John Lennon, it was about remembering all the people they loved and lost over the years. Now and Then became more than just a song, it became a piece of history. It showed them how much recording technology had changed from the 1960s to today. It also raised big questions about what makes a real band recording when you're using computers to help. The song proved that even 50 plus years after they broke up, the Beatles could still bring the whole world together around their music. It didn't matter if some critics thought it was too sentimental or too produced. Billions of people loved it, and that's what counted. So what can we learn from this amazing journey of Now and Then? The song shows us that great art never really dies. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to come alive. It started as John Lennon fooling around his piano in 1979 with a TV on in the background. 44 years later, it became a worldwide phenomenon that brought joy to millions of people and made music history. The song is proof that the Beatles' magic was real and lasting. Even though John and George are gone and Paul and Ringo are in their 80s, they can still create something that touched people's hearts all around the world. Now and Then is more than just a song, it's a time capsule, a love letter, and a miracle of technology all rolled into one. It shows us that with enough love, patience, and the right technology, even impossible dreams can come true. From a scratchy cassette tape to a Grammy nomination, from John's living room to the top of the charts, Now and Then proves that the Beatles story isn't really over. As long as people love music, their songs will keep finding new ways to bring us together. That might be the most beautiful thing of all. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through the story of Now and Then. Truly the last Beatles song. What do you think of this amazing story? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more music history and physical media content on this channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again.